Thank you so much again for being here today. It is good to see each of you, and we trust that you've been blessed as we've listened to our voices. Let me invite you to pick out your message guide this morning. It's available for you in your program, and you can follow along that way. And as you're following along, let me invite you to turn in your Bibles to Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17. You can use your own Bible. You can follow along using one that's available for you there at your seat. It's page 984. And we invite you to follow along as we continue in this little series that we're just calling a call to worship. We're focusing on worship and laying some foundational thoughts with regard to this as we look forward as a church. And so let me just remind you a little bit of these foundational principles or these foundational things that we went over last week and laid out for you. Just three very simple things. And first one is this, is that worship is not defined by Sunday morning. For some of us, when we see worship, this is naturally what we think about. We think about this hour, 10:45 to 12 o'clock, 12, or thereabouts. And so, but worship is so much more than that. For us, sometimes it's our singing, or it's Christian music, or all of these things can be worship, but that's not the entirety of worship. That doesn't define it. The second thing we looked at was that worship is really all of life. That worship is, true worship is ascribing the greatest worth or value to God. It's giving Him ultimacy in all things. And that needs to happen moment by moment. That needs to happen hour by hour. That needs to happen not just in the hour that we have on Sunday, but that needs to happen in the hours of Monday through Saturday. And actually, all of life and all that we do is actually an act of worship because it's all for or to Him. And we saw that in Hebrews chapter 13 last week in 15 to 16, verses 15 and 16. And then the third foundational idea was that worship really is the ongoing activity of every human being. Every one of us is a worshiper. It's not only all of our life, but we are all worshipers. That if you would, we can spread that out. Everyone who is a Christian is a worshiper. But everyone who is not a Christian is a worshiper. Everyone who is, we're praying over the next 30 days for those who are followers of Islam, they're worshipers. Buddhists are worshipers. People who follow Hindu are worshipers. People who would consider themselves to be atheists or agnostic, they're worshipers. All of us are worshipers. Everyone is a worshiper. Everyone esteems someone or something. Everyone puts something in that place of greatest value, of ultimacy. And so we were left with the question last week, so what does a 24/7, a moment-by-moment, day-by-day worshiper do? What do we do? What do we do? And so that brings us to this week. Have you ever heard of cargo cults? Cargo cults. Pretty weird term, and you really don't hear it that much anymore, but it was heard much more back in the 20th century, particularly going into the 50s, 60s, 70s, those decades. Cargo cults were found in the Pacific, South Pacific, more specifically, and they were a continuing legacy of World War II. When the Allied troops began to sweep across the South Pacific, and they would come in and they would drop containers, cargo containers, and they would set up airstrips to supply troops and to allow for landing and taking off and those types of things. There were many people who lived on these small islands or who had never seen anything like that. They had never seen or known of anyone other than themselves. And so all of a sudden, these individuals who had no exposure to the outside world were invaded, if you would, by modern civilization. All of a sudden, modernity fell out of the sky or landed on their beach. And they had to come to grips with things that many of us have had decades, indeed our whole lives, to come to grips with. They had but a moment. And so when the war ended, these island bases, ultimately because of the call of troops and stuff like that, they were abandoned. And so all of a sudden, these things that they really had no way of dealing with and really being able to process, all of a sudden, those things that were very real to them were gone. They felt forsaken, and so they began to misinterpret the things that they had seen and what they had experienced. And really, in some ways, sociologists said that they were launched into what they called a dark ignorance. They constructed scale models of the things that they had seen and desired, and they hoped by that to lure, quote, the cargo gods back. And so they built little cargo things, and they built little representations of the things that they saw coming out of these containers that had now disappeared, and they were trying in so doing to bring the cargo gods back. Acts 17, that I asked you to turn to, is really one of the best stories, one of the best experiences, best accounts in the book of Acts. And here it is, in some sense, if you could, there's a sense of the cargo gods here in Acts 17. A cargo cult. Paul here is the hero. He is a hero, and he's been preaching the gospel. If you know anything about Paul, he's a person who was not ashamed to share the good news of Christ with the people that God brought across the path of his life. And in so doing, many times he created enemies. He was not a popular individual for the message that he carried because he spoke the truth. And so we see this, actually, if you back up one chapter into Acts chapter 16, you're going to see this happens in Philippi. He gets imprisoned, he's flogged, he gets out because of citizenship in Rome. And Acts 17, he preaches in Thessalonica, and he causes a riot. And so they sneak him out of the city. Berea, the same thing happens. And that people get agitated over and over again as Paul shares and as he preaches this message with regard to Christ. And so here in Acts chapter 17, at this particular portion, he is in Athens. And Athens is a prominent city. It's really a center of culture for the Greek world. It is commercial. It is political. With the rise of the Romans a little bit, Corinth really becomes that center. But at its summit, Athens is best known for philosophers like Aristotle, which is a familiar name, ought to be a familiar name, Plato, Socrates. Great thinkers were a part of the Athens culture. No other city really had such a great impact on thinking. It was a religious center. Athens was a happening place. It was an influential place. And so I want to pick up the experience here in Acts chapter 17 in verse 16, start there, and unpack this idea this morning. Next week we looked at what is worship, how do we define this. This week I want to ask us the question, so what do we then worship? What do we give this definition if it is ascribing ultimate value, ultimacy to someone or something? Then the question becomes, who do we give that to? Who are we giving that to? It's another reflective question. So look at verse 16, if you would. Now, while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Therefore, he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshippers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. So here we have Athens, and Athens is a place that we see here in Scripture is filled with idols. It is given over to idols. Every god in existence that they knew of was worshipped there, or at least had some place so that he could be worshipped there. Overrun with worship places and idols. Petronius, this is a famous quote with regard to Athens. It is easier to find a god in Athens than a man. That's how many different gods and statues and places and whatever completely given over to worship. Full of idols. Every public building dedicated to a god. Paul went to Athens to wait there for Silas. And as he was waiting there for Silas and for Timothy to go on then to Corinth from here in his travels, he couldn't help himself. And he's greatly distressed, it says in verse 16, he's greatly distressed over the situation that he finds here in Athens. That the place is overrun with gods. And so he reasons in the synagogue with the Jews and with God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace from day to day. He's out there and he's in the exchange. He's warring for truth, if you would, the truth of Christ on two different fronts. We see he's in the synagogue and he's talking with the Jews and the God-fearers, the church. And he's in the marketplace. He's on Main Street. He's out there in the community. And he's talking with them. Anyone who will listen. And so it is that Paul is there and he's out there in the midst of this dialogue, and this is how it continues. It says, then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him. And some said, what does this babbler want to say? Others said, he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods, because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection. Now, Athens, if you know the history of it, has two, if you would, rival philosophical factions. Two philosophical schools that are going against each other. You have the Epicureans and you have the Stoics. Now, the Epicureans believed that the goal of life was pleasure. If it feels good, then we what? Then we do it. Their goal is pleasure. Deny yourself no pleasure. Spare every pain. There may be gods, they felt, but if there are gods, they're not involved with us. We just do our own thing. We're free to do our own thing, and we're just going to get the feels, and that's going to be great. But then there's this other side, if you would, Stoic. A lot of us are Stoic. A lot of Baptists are Stoic. You ever notice that? They're very straight-faced. Yeah. But there's these Stoic people here, and their big purpose was to align with great thinking and with thoughts and ideas and truths over feelings. They were the thinkers, they were the heady people. It wasn't about pleasure, it wasn't about pain, it was about self-discipline. It was about mastery. It was about taking control of yourself and your mind. And so here they are, and these people, they're going back and forth, and they're not only are they now fighting it amongst themselves, these two ideas, but they realize this new person has kind of entered the scene here. So here's Paul, and they say, what in the world is going on with this babbler? This babbler. It's a word, it's a unique word, it's a great word. It's a word that means seed picker. Seed picker. So they're looking at Paul and they're saying, here's this guy, and he's picking a little seed over here, and a little stuff like that, and kind of mixes them all together. He's a babbler. He's just coming with all these little ideas and stuff from all over the place. And so they recognize that he's there, and it goes on to say, and they took him. They brought him to the Areopagus, and they said, may we know what this new doctrine is of which you speak? For you are bringing some strange things to our ears. Therefore, we want to know what these things mean. And so they bring him to the Areopagus. They bring him to the council, to Mars Hill. And here's this oversight group of religious people, of educated individuals, and they meet there. And they pull him aside, and they want to kind of pull back the veil on Paul and what he's talking about. And they say, share with us this idea. Particularly, share with us this idea of resurrection, because neither of these groups believed that there was a resurrection. And so here Paul has the opportunity to share with them. He comes into their council and they engage in this dialogue. All of the Athenians, it says, verse 21, and the foreigners who were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. It's really interesting as we head from this point forward to think about how Paul chooses to present the gospel. Now, one of the things that is very obvious here, and we'll hit on it a little bit, is that Paul is a student of his audience. He recognizes from what he has seen thus far that these individuals to whom he is speaking are thinking people, but they are also incredibly spiritual in a generic sense. They are religious. I can remember one time I had taken a group of young people from our church in New York City. New York City is a great place to take students to help them to learn to share their faith. They are able to encounter all different kinds of ethnic groups and cultures and stuff like that. It really is the closest thing to going overseas without going overseas. And I can remember we were spending the day in Central Park, and we were just engaging people in conversation, hanging out on blankets, talking with people, having lunch with people who were sitting. And I can remember coming up to this guy, and he's sitting there. And, I just sat down, a safe, comfortable, and so we engaged in conversation, we started to talk. And so he's reading a book, and I said, what are you reading? He says, I'm reading the Quran. And I looked at him, and, I was judging. Right? This guy, by his appearance, did not look like someone who would be reading the Quran. And so I said, well, why are you doing that? And so we started talking, and so it comes out, he said, for a season I was this, and I was a Christian, and then I spent some time, and I was reading, this, and stuff like that. And he says, now I'm reading the Quran. And I said, wow. I said, it seems to me that you're really interested in spiritual things. And so, if you would, I took a note out of Paul's playbook because he noticed these people, they obviously have an interest in religion, in spiritual things. They have an interest in spiritual things. And so Paul doesn't begin with Jewish history. He doesn't begin with his background. He doesn't take them to the synagogue. It would be futile to talk with many of these individuals about those types of things. So he starts where the ground is common. And that is that they do have an interest in spiritual things. If you would, he starts with the fact that they are worshipers. They're worshipers. All of us are worshipers. It's a common ground place. They may not see themselves as worshipers. There are all different kinds of worshipers. There are football worshipers. Right these days, there are hockey worshipers. There are NASCAR worshipers. There are all different kinds of worshipers, and all different kinds of people worship all different kinds of things, or all different individuals or people. And he sees, and here are a whole city of worshipers. We're all worshipers. But he points out this one thing in particular here. And it's in verse 23. He says this, "For I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship. I even found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you." Let me just talk about being smart. I mean, Paul is like smart. To get into the minds and to engage conversation with these worshipers, because he knew, if you would, that they were worshipers. Even under the surface there was worship going on. He comes and he begins to talk about who or what demands their worship. And here in Athens, as it was set up to worship. They had all of them, but just in case there was one they didn't have, they had an empty spot, if you would, the unknown God. The one that we haven't found yet. The one that we're looking for. And so it is, they have this place there. they've got everything covered. And so Paul makes this perfect connection with them in verse 24. He says this, God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. And here, if you would, this is why Paul kind of almost gets killed all the time. Because he just brings it to him. He says, hey, you've got this altar here, and you've got all of these altars, and you're covering all your bases. You want to make sure you got that extra spot for that one that you didn't think of, or you didn't know about, or somebody didn't bring your way. And he says, let me tell you, I'm going to bring it your way, and I'm going to tell you who this guy is. And I'm sure at this point, they are like, tell us, Paul. Tickle our ears. Paul, our minds are working. Tell us about this person. And then he says, hey, this God, he made the world. He made everything that is in it. That he's the Lord of the heavens, what you see above and cannot even see beyond our sight, and that which is below. He doesn't dwell in temples with hands. He doesn't dwell. He's not a monument. He's not a statue. He's not formed out of rock or whatever. He's not worshipped with men's hands or the creations of their hands. He doesn't need anything because he is the one who gives life and breath to all. And so here he is up on the top of the hill, and he looks out and he speaks to these people and he says, you can't make God. You can't make him. In fact, you can't make him, but he made you. He made you. You fashioned these with your hands. But the one that you don't know is the one who fashioned you. And I'm here to tell you about him. That he is the Lord, that he's the master, that he is the ruler, he is the creator of all things. And that he does not live in any of your temples. He's not dependent upon you. In fact, without you even knowing it, you are dependent on him. I wonder if you're here today, and in your life, as you walk through life, you have tried to cover your bases best you can. But you're not quite sure whether you've got them all covered. So in your life, in some way, shape, or form, you have a place that says to the unknown God. That you have that little bit of open spot to say, you know what, just in case this really doesn't, I just want to cover this. Can I be so bold as to say this morning that the God that we worship and the Christ that we exalt is the one who belongs in that place? That he is the one who has created all of the things, both the heaven above and the earth below. That he is the one that 2 Sundays ago we remembered and celebrated, who gave his life for you and for me so that we could have our relationship with God repaired. So that the sin issues, our areas of missing the mark can be taken away, can be covered over. So that we can enter that relationship with our Heavenly Father that we have not had. Let me tell you this morning that perhaps for you, you're hearing about the unknown God of your life for the very first time today. And Paul brings it to him. And he says, hey, let me tell you about this person. And so to those who thought they had it all figured out, this must have been pretty offensive, pretty tough for them to swallow. He goes on and he says, and he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their callings, that he's in control of all these things. He goes on to say, verse 27, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. He said, you know what, We grope around and we try all of these different things, all these different gods, all these different temples, all these different, he says, and we grope around this in the darkness, but he says, in fact, the one, this unknown God that you're really looking for to fill the emptiness, he is right there. He's right there. He is not far from each of us. For every creation, he goes on to say, Paul, this is over in Romans 1. He's not far, he's all around us. He's presented himself. Since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. He says it's all around us. Creation is enough when people see it. Scripture says that they're without, it's all there right in front. So he confronts them and he speaks to them, plainly and directly about who are you going to worship? What are you going to do with that? Verse 28, for in him we live and move and have our being, as also some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. He begins with their culture. He quotes their poets. We are his offspring. He has created us. We're made in his image. Therefore, he says, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by the art of man's devising. He says, since we're made in his image, and since he has formed us and fashioned us, since this is God, who are we to create God? To give him a form, to say this is what he looks like. He created us. We don't create him. And so in verse 30, he says, truly these times of ignorance God overlooked. But now he commands that all men everywhere repent. He says there was a time when God, just out of grace and mercy, withheld his wrath out of love. But he says that he now commands people to repent because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world of righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. And so he says, you know, at the time of that grace, he says, now is closed. He says, now you need to repent, you need to come to him, because the day is coming. And so Paul, he lays it out there for them. He gives them assurance that this is coming by raising his son from the dead. And there's a lot here. These two verses, 30 and 31, there's enough there for us to spend a lot of time on. But to walk through this truth about worship, and that is what they are. They're worshipers, and they're worshiping the wrong thing. It's going in the wrong direction. We're all worshipers, just like these Athenians. So what's the truth today? What are we going to hold on to? So today's truth is this. The question is not do you worship, because we are all worshipers, but who or what do you worship? Who or what do you worship? It was interesting. Yesterday was May the 4th. Or, on certain channels, May the 4th be with you. So it's very interesting. I haven't watched some of those Star Wars movies in a long time. But there's this scene where Luke Skywalker goes to Yoda, and Yoda is going to teach him the ways of the Force, so he can become a Jedi. And Luke is trying and he fails, and he tries and he fails, and he gets down on himself, and he's a whiner, right? He's just a whiner. And finally Yoda says to him, no try. There is no try. There is only do. There's only do. When it comes to worship, we could talk about trying to worship. But the fact of the matter is that whether we think about it or not, we all worship. There is only do. Our trying, perhaps, is trying to get it in the right direction, but all of us do worship. We all do worship. So what? Or who do you worship? first spot in your life? What has the ultimacy in your day, in your time? If I was to ask you, hopefully all of you would say, well, God is who I worship. God is that. And last week we looked at that idea that we find that in our lips, what we do with our lips, how we speak in our life, the things that we do. Another way to discover where your worship lies is to follow the trail. You ever follow the trail? How you spend your time. Follow the trail of your time, the trail of your energy, of your effort, of your affections. Follow the trail of your affections, of your allegiances. Follow the trail of your money. Where's your money now? Talking about marriage night coming up. Have you ever heard anybody say, oh gosh, he worships the ground that she walks on? How can you say that? Because by observing what he does, the trail leads to her. His affection leads to her. His effort leads to her. His time leads to her. If I were to follow those things in your life, where would those trails, those paths lead? Who sits on the throne that the trails of your life go to? Who would I find there? Who would I find there? For most people, sadly, let me just say, for many people, probably if I were to follow the trail, it would lead to a mirror. Because the person who sits on that throne is myself, me. But the person who deserves to sit on that throne, and where we're going to kind of bring it to a bow this morning, the person who deserves to sit on that throne of the unknown God that perhaps you're searching for, is Jesus Christ. That he is the one who is worthy to receive honor and glory. That he is the one who is worthy of our praise. He is worthy to sit on that throne. There's another verse there that I'm not going to have us go through. It's from Isaiah. I can trust that you'll take the time to maybe look at it this week and kind of think about that in terms of worship. But I want to close, what is worship? It's putting in that ultimate place, that value place. And so it begs us to ask the question, who or what do we worship? And Paul in Athens comes to the place and he says, guys, you are worshipers. You're religious, you're spiritual. You're looking for answers. You're pursuing that part of you that God has put in there that wants to be itchy. And you're trying to scratch it, but let me tell you, the way you really need to scratch it is to find out who's the unknown person that you haven't encountered yet. And that's why I'm here, Paul says. I'm here to tell you that the one who sits on that throne is the one who's created all things. He's the one who is one day going to come and he's going to deal with your lives. And he is sealed to that by the fact that he sent his son and his son came back to life. And so today, where are you who sits on that throne? Where are you in your relationship with Christ?